Neil Hamilton.
UKIP applauds the social partnership approach of the Welsh Government because no sensible person wants to see confrontation in industrial relations. The Cabinet Secretary and I are old enough to remember a time when there really was confrontation in industry and in public services in this country. That's why the trade union reforms of the 1980s were brought in. In the 1970s, there was an average of 13 million days lost to strikes every year. In the 1980s, that halved to 7 million. In the 1990s, it was down to 660,000, where it's been, broadly speaking, static ever since. And that's why the Labour governments under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown made no attempt to repeal the legislation which they and their predecessors so vigorously opposed when it was passing through the House of Commons in the 1980s. Now, if the social partnership model of the Welsh Government is so successful, which it appears to be, I can't really understand why they think that the proposed measure being introduced at Westminster is such a threat to the good relations that currently exists between public service unions and the government in its various forms in Wales, because the illusory threat of having to have a strike ballot to reach the thresholds in the proposed legislation won't even be triggered because of the approach which the Welsh Government takes. So I wonder what is the purpose of introducing the bill to take up the time of this Assembly when there are many more pressing matters that we can use the time upon. It is a fact that trade unions are virtually extinct, or at least redundant, outside the public sector in the United Kingdom today. In the real world, as it were, where people have to trade their services, then trade unions no longer seem to have very much of a role as voluntary membership organisations. They have to persuade people to stump up their membership subscriptions, and they haven't been terribly successful at persuading their potential members to do so. In the public sector, it's very, very different. There's a very high proportion of people who join a union. That is because the difference between the public and the private sector is that decisions ultimately in the public sector are political, because the employer ultimately are politicians, and therefore this is the way in which pressure is brought. I think anything which makes it easier to call a strike in these circumstances is a threat to the interests of the public at large. And after all, trade unions and their members are a sectional interest, not the public as a whole, and we're talking here 100% about public services that every single elector and the electors' children will use at some time during the year. Surely the interests of the public must take precedence over sectional interests, and therefore it is right that there should be a reasonable threshold before calling a strike. Strikes should be not the first resort, but the last resort. And I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary, why are we playing with fire in this instance?
Well, it will be no surprise to members here that I don't agree with the member's recollection of history, but it isn't just his understanding of the past that's at fault here, it's his understanding of the present as well. His idea that there are no unions involved in private companies in Wales. Has he not heard of Ford or Tata or Toyota or many other private sector employers that I could mention? I have to say to him what the First Minister said to him yesterday. His interest in reasonable thresholds was much less to be seen during the referendum campaign, when he was not interested in introducing artificial thresholds into that piece of voting. And he asked me about the provisions in our bill. Let me just give him one example of why we are so determined to act. The UK government's bill places new barriers in the path of workplace representation. Now, why do we think that having proper access to time in order to represent your members is so important? It's because you cannot have a social partnership model unless all the partners at the table have access to the time they need in order to discharge their responsibilities. It simply makes the likelihood of strikes greater, not less, if employers are unable to speak directly in a timely fashion on behalf of those people that they represent. All our bill does is to retain the status quo in that regard, the status quo that has been successful. His way of doing things would take us backwards. Our aim is to make sure that the future of industrial relations in our great public services is properly sustained by a balanced set of relationships between the Welsh Government, employers and employees. And I say again to Assembly members, this is not a bill simply supported by trade unions, it is supported by the great public service employers as well. They see the advantages of having proper representation for their workers because that's how they have the dialogue they need in order to address and resolve the collective issues that face them.